I've spent the last 12 years diving every day in the great African sea forest. In these 4,300 dives, I've come to know and love many extraordinary creatures who have been my most valued teachers. I've learned a great deal about their secret lives, but ironically, they've taught me so much about my own life and my humanity. I've seen that we are in grave danger of losing our wild hearts. There's a powerful person in all of us, waiting to be let out, waiting to speak the oldest language on earth, waiting to meet our animal kin. I feel being in touch with this wildness is the key to regenerating biodiversity, the life support system of our planet, and rekindling our own physical and spiritual well-being. Over the last 3 years, I've felt compelled to write a book about what I've learned. It's called Amphibious Soul: Finding the Wild in a Tame World. Printed in the book is a digital code connecting the reader to a new 27-part short film series. This book builds on our film My Octopus Teacher, but goes much deeper into the living matrix that is just waiting for us to make a connection and spark a lifetime of joy and transformation.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs Program. My name is John Young. I knew that without reading. I'm an author, storyteller, and your moderator for this evening. The club would like to thank the Bernard Osher Foundation for supporting this Good Lit event and the Cal Academy of Sciences and Wonderfest. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my dear brother, Craig Foster, author of Amphibious Soul: Finding the Wild in a Tame World. Craig is an Academy Award and BAFTA-winning filmmaker of My Octopus Teacher. His films have won over 150 international awards, and he is the first person to create a method of underwater tracking in the kelp forest. Craig has contributed greatly to marine sciences through his discovery of new species and new animal behaviors. He is the co-founder of the Sea Change Project, an NGO dedicated to long-term conservation and regeneration of the great African sea forest. Craig founded the Sea Change Project to share his love of nature with others and keep his pact to dive 365 times a year for over a decade. Craig believes that the greatest threat we face is the cooling of the human heart towards nature. All his work is about inspiring a change of heart, inspiring people to care for and regenerate nature around them. Craig, welcome and congratulations on your new book. Let me start off by asking you a couple of questions, if I may.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes.
So amazing to be here with all of you, and so incredible to be with my friend John. We've had extraordinary adventures in Africa, and John is a great mentor, a master tracker, and just a huge inspiration to me. So thank you, John.
Thank you. Craig, a lot of people want you to explain the title, Amphibious Soul. What do you mean by this?
So I had the privilege of these extraordinary experiences face to face with many animals, not just the octopus. And they really taught me so much about how to move my body in the kelp forest, but ultimately they taught me about humanity in a strange way. And I realized that we are, in many ways, all living a double life. And I felt this wild person in all of us and this tame person. So this is how this idea of this amphibious soul came into being. That really came through the animals, and my deep passion and desire was to try to let that wild person come out more, because I feel that that wild person's been smothered by the tame. I'm not against the tame, I'm just looking for that balance that is very powerful and interesting when it comes into being. And I'm not always myself in balance at all. I feel quite unbalanced tonight in many ways, having gone through this amazing, interesting, wild tour here. But there's moments of grace when you feel that balance, and it's quite extraordinary.
And there's a lot more on that in the book itself, where that amphibious soul really just comes to light, and it's like, oh yes, yes. Also, there's questions about this picture, which looks somewhat like a human eye. It also looks a bit like a planet. What is that?
So, John, that is the blue button. It's an extraordinary animal that lives in the open ocean. And that particular animal came from the open ocean into the Great African Sea Forest. They're very delicate. They're distantly related to jellyfish. Quite small, but they're hardly ever intact. So I shot that from below, and it has those connotations as you suggest.
So that's actually your photo there, and that's beautiful. Okay. All right, so a large part of what you and I both know, and probably, I bet you there's people out there in the audience who are also wildlife trackers or honor that. Finding your wild self is related to this ancient art of tracking. And you often refer to it as the oldest language, but you know what that means. I know what that means. I think Lonner out there knows what it means. But help other people understand. What do you mean by oldest language?
So our species, Homo sapiens, has been around for approximately 300,000 years. And for all of that time, except for the last maybe 2 or 3% of our time on this planet, we have been conversant in this oldest language, been able to follow animal tracks, see an enormous range of signs left by animals, because that's been an intricate part of our survival. Every wild child knew this language. They knew the bird language that John is a world authority on. They knew so much about the wild language because it was intricately woven into their survival. So tracking is really about knowing at least several thousand signs in nature and be able to interpret them, and it's almost like a conversation with the wild. And these wonderful mysteries, and I often phone John and say, I've seen this and that, what do you think it is? And he thinks about it, and it comes back to me, and we have this amazing group of trackers, and we try and work out these nature mysteries. And it's deeply satisfying because you feel like you are living out your human design. That's what every wild-born child is expecting, is to do these primal activities. Storytelling, dancing's all part of that too, social interaction. It's not just animals, but this is a very powerful part of that wild design.
So I think for people who are sitting out there, you may not actually think of yourselves in, this doesn't really pertain to me, right? But it does. Yeah, because we are all from this lineage that Craig is describing. These are our collective ancestors, right? Would you speak a little bit to that? Just how all of us have descended from.
Yeah, I mean, I've had the privilege of working with this incredible paleoscience team in Africa. I've been working in Blombos Cave and other caves, tracking our prehistory, looking at the archaeology. And what we see is, what's incredible, if you look at, we're 300,000 years old, 70,000 years ago, there were only 10,000 people in the entire world. And we all come from those people. And there are even times in prehistory where that number even went smaller. So these ancestors, because of their survival, their tracking skills, if they hadn't been able to survive, none of us would be sitting here today. So I literally, and even in a scientific sense, our minds, our bodies, everything is built upon their intelligence and their connection to nature. We have them in our blood. We can see them in our blood. So they're with us. They're with us here all tonight. And we all related. Every single person in this room and in the world is related, and we all come from Africa. That's our original home. That's where it all started. And I often say, like, whenever John or anybody else visits Cape Town, I always say, welcome home, because of that. And if any of you ever come visit, I will say the same thing.
Mm-hmm. So those 10,000 people are your great ancestors, my great ancestors, and everybody in this room.
Yeah.
Okay, so this means that the language that they spoke is part of the wiring of our brains, in essence. And you speak about how the landscape speaks through this language, and this will speak to all of you as well, because it's, when we were standing on the road to come over here earlier, I just felt called to look up, and I was feeling all this stress from the drive, and there's these two beautiful brown pelicans soaring so slowly over, and I just felt myself just go, okay, right? Ignore the steel and stone. I'm here, I'm seen, and so the landscape literally speaks to us. So it doesn't matter where we are. It doesn't matter if we identify, I'm a tracker, but I don't spend my time under the water, and none of you have to either. As I heard you say last night in Santa Cruz, this can start where for people?
I mean, people who are working in corporate business, I spoke to amazing publishing visionary Judith Kerr today, and she's a story hunter. So she's tracking in that environment. Everybody's tracking in a way. But when you do the primal activity of tracking animals or humans, that does activate, I think, in a deeper way. So it's quite an easy thing to start. And if anybody's interested, you literally just have to go out. And the best thing is to go to a place that's very close to your house. It can be your backyard. I've even tracked now in the middle of New York City on the concrete with but it's about getting to know those animals and plants that are in your immediate vicinity and watching them and observing them in a deep way and trying to see signs that animals are leaving and their behaviors and slowly building up this library of what they're doing. And over time, slowly putting those dots together. So just the first tracks and the species are these letters, and eventually you build up the words, and then you start to eventually this language starts to come out. And it's not as difficult as you think. It just requires curiosity and persistence, but it's quite transformative, and as John will know better than I do, it changes the way you think and feel.
Yeah, I would say what Craig said in passing there about curiosity, that's where it really begins, isn't it? We follow our curiosity, whether it's, as I've heard you say, it could just be an insect. It doesn't have to be a deer leaving a track. It could be, I want to build a connection to this being that I'm seeing each day in my yard, right? And then beginning to accumulate those. And tell us a little bit about an experience you had as this first underwater tracker, because you quite literally are, applying all this amazing layered technique to all these years underwater every day for 10 years. you have a story about the octopus in a helmet shell, which I think really illustrates how these things can yield, how the landscape can speak to you.
So what I was seeing, it took me about 2 or 3 years to see my first underwater tracks, and then from there I could see hundreds of tracks quite quickly. But what was really strange were these helmet shells. They're like a big marine snail, and I was finding them dead and there was no animal in the shell, and they were rolling around on the sea floor, and I just could not figure out initially what was going on. And it took, sometimes these things can take months, even years, and this took several months. And eventually I collected some of these shells and noticed this tiniest little hole right on the end of the spiral. And then I started analyzing the different predation marks of the different animals in the forest and trying to figure it all out. And then you have these kind of aha moments when I found one of these helmet shells right next to an octopus den and realized that the octopus were coming out at night, putting their arms down into the sand and pulling these helmet shells out, drilling through the shells, dropping the poison then pulling the bodies out. So then that mystery gets solved. And it just goes on until you have this extraordinary web of knowledge, and you get inside the secret lives of these animals. And that's when it starts getting really exciting.
So you hinted at this briefly, but when we have these really good, it starts with curiosity, right? But I'm sure it wasn't just curiosity for you. When you were finding these empty helmet shells rolling around on the bottom of the water, but you never saw a living helmet shell, is that correct? A living version of that? They were just invisible to you. You were just finding their dead bodies.
Exactly, yeah.
So you were probably, if it was me, it would drive me a little bit mad. Like, I'd be like, I have to know what's going on here. Do you get that feeling?
Very much so. I mean, most of the time I've got 20 or 30 mysteries in my head that I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah. My mentor's elder, who is his mentor, said people will walk through their lives in these times that we live in now, and they may never have a question in their head. They'll never think beyond the limits of what they learned in school or what they read in books. And he said that on any given day, he wanted to hold at least 5 good questions in his mind. And you just said 20 or 30, so I think you've kind of blown through another wall, Craig. What happens when you carry a question? Like, what does it feel like? It feels like your curiosity becomes passionate, it becomes a quest. Like, what happens with that? What do you notice, the pattern of it?
What exactly do you mean? Sorry.
Well, do the answers come to you? How do you find the answers?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So sometimes, you come up against these walls, and the conscious mind just cannot figure out. It's just too complex. And then, what it's a great thing to do, and this is a lot of what I've learned with John on land, and then tried to apply it in the water, is you just keep very, very still. And you just float, and you let your body and all the brown fat heaters warm you up in the cold. You let that incredible chemistry that's rushing through your brain, the 250% increase in dopamine, sometimes 500% increase in adrenaline, stimulate you. And you just quieten the conscious mind. And then the subconscious can look around, and it seems to be better at picking up detail and allow the thoughts from the subconscious to bubble to the surface of the conscious mind. And I had this mystery which I was trying to work out for 3 years. I was finding these shells of these heart urchins, just the dead shells, and just could never figure out where these animals were. None of the marine biologists knew. And one day I was just gave up completely and did this practice. And somehow my unconscious mind was able to tell me, go there and look underneath the sand. And I dug underneath the sand and I lifted this animal out of the sand, and there was the live heart urchin. It's a detritivore, and it lives under the sand, and it leaves the most subtle track that your conscious mind would not see initially, but my unconscious was able to see that, or the subconscious. And it was tremendously gratifying. And then we did a whole scientific study of these animals and discovered 3 other invertebrates that live actually on that animal. And we've been working with them for several years, and did some master's student worked on it and so on. So that's kind of the how it works. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah, my mentor, again, he would say, put the quest in question.
Nice.
Put the search in research. And I feel like you're really exemplifying that. Yeah. Would you tell us a little bit about the otter tracks that you found that were made in ink on the rock? I think I love that story.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes these animals are doing the most incredible things. So I was kayaking along the coast. It was quite a calm day, and I almost went past, and I just saw on the bare rock what looked like someone had painted tracks on the rock. So I surfed the kayak up the rock, got out, and there it looked like someone had taken a paintbrush and ink and literally drew the tracks of the Cape clawless otter onto the rock in ink. These were not made by water, because often you see an animal walking out the water and it's just these wet tracks. And for quite a while it had me a bit stumped. And then what you do is you try to take your mind and put it into the mind of the otter. And I know all the prey animals of the otter, so I was soon able to figure out that it had either killed a cuttlefish or an octopus, and while it was eating that animal, it had been standing in all the ink from the ink sac and smearing its paws in the ink. And then when it finished, it moved away and printed these perfect footprints in ink across the rock, and it looks absolutely magnificent. It was taking 100 pictures. And then I was able to determine, because I know the difference between the ink of a octopus and a cuttlefish. And then I was able to determine it was what we call a patchwork cuttlefish. So that's kind of how it works. And it's tremendously satisfying, and then you sort of have this wonderful dialogue with the wild.
Mm. In the beginning, you weren't so relaxed in all of this. You were recovering from stress, anxiety from the films and all the pressures on you. But then you eventually found this very, very calm, very still, very relaxed place within yourself. And what gifts did you receive from that, from the wild beings on occasion?
The story that jumps to mind is, and I think all of you will relate to this in your life. You flow in and out of these states of being in a good space and then not. But it's amazing how the animals can detect that, can detect your muscle tension, your heartbeat. They've got the sensors that can look inside your body, especially the elasmobranchs, the sharks, and the rays. And we have the largest stingray in the world. They get up to about 14, 15 feet long, 12 feet wide. They're almost the size of a car. And they have an enormous tail with these massive spines. If that spine gets into your leg or your arm, you lose the arm or the leg. If you get in the torso, you're dead. But these animals are not aggressive in any way. So I dived down to about 5 meters, and I was just settled on the bottom, quite a way away. I don't approach animals, especially not animals like that. And this huge stingray, I mean, the body is about this thick, turned and came towards me, I just kept dead still. The best thing is to just keep still, and then there's absolutely no aggression, and just calm everything down. You just relax every muscle in your body, calm the heartbeat down. And this enormous animal covered my body, and then I could feel the massive weight pressing me into the seabed. And the skin is beautifully smooth. And in that time, it's so powerful that you just completely relax, and there's almost an ecstatic feeling. And you just feel that enormous animal and the privilege of being. It weighs almost a ton, so you're not moving, but it's not putting all its weight on. So it's an extraordinary feeling. You don't feel like breathing. You're just enjoying that incredible moment. And you know that animal is not going to harm you in any way. That tail can move anywhere. It's like a giant scorpion. So you just keep still, and you certainly don't struggle or relax. And then, of course, it just slowly moves off, and you just watch it go away and up to the surface. And it's just, these are these moments of grace that are so special, and you just, that stays with you forever.
Another moment, yes. Oh, questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your questions. And another moment when you had this encounter with the otter that seemed to want to interact with you in some meaningful way, like hunt with you or do something with you. Yeah, this is one of my favorites.
So, what is, sometimes people think, oh, you're just having these kind of moments the whole time, which is not the case at all. Most of the time, animals are not that interested in one's presence, and especially if you're just quiet in the water and very still, moving very gently. I often don't kick my legs at all because they can feel the pressure waves, much like your bird plow, moving loudly through the forest on land. So, but what is strange is occasionally, so you can go past like 100 fish or 1,000 fish, and then one day one of them will just suddenly be curious and come right up to you and make contact. And I'm not quite sure why that happens, but what John is referring to was quite early on, maybe 3 years into diving every day, this Cape clawless otter, and these animals are extremely shy. Some people who have lived where I am have never seen one. I was very early morning, very cold, and was thinking to myself, what the hell am I doing here? So in the early days, people thought I was like, what the hell was I doing? And I suddenly felt the presence of this animal, and I didn't face it. I just kept away because they're frightened of the mouth and of being bitten, because that's how otter language works. I just kept still. This animal came up behind me and started touching my feet. And I just kept dead still. It was an extraordinary feeling. And then slowly worked its way around, and then just looked straight into my eyes. And they're clawless otters. They've got human-like hands, and just sort of touching my face and looking into my eyes. And it was almost too much. And I didn't know what this animal was doing. So after about 10 minutes, I couldn't. It was just too much. So I got out and lay on the rock. And this animal came right up to me and was calling, wanting me to come back in the water. I didn't know what was going on. And then I spoke to my wife Swati, and actually to Anna Breitenbach, who's a friend of ours. And it turns out that we have quite a long relationship of hunting cooperatively with otters. And perhaps this was some deep evolutionary memory in this animal wanting to engage like this again, or just perhaps pure curiosity or something else. A lot of these things are mysterious, but they have a profound effect. And then that sort of, when you do another 100 dives and you think, what am I doing? And then these animals sort of keep you inspired.
That's beautiful. We have another little piece of film I think we want to show. Is that right?
Great, yeah. So you may know, but part of the book is the what I've done, because film is something I've done since I was a child, and writing the book, I've just made these films that have just been like raw passion projects, films that I've about stories in the book as we went along. And there's a code in the book that can trigger this 27 of these short films. So this is just an example of that. And it's just, it reminds me, just wonderful to have Rachel here. I've worked for 4 years with her and 2 years on this book. And this is the first time we've met, because I've worked remotely from South Africa, and we've spoke about this years ago, and now these things are actually real. So incredible to have you here. I feel I know her very well, but it's the first time we physically met. So we'd just like to show you an example of one of those films, and it's also an example of an animal, a very unusual octopus. And this has nothing to do with the octopus in My Octopus Teacher. It happened several years afterwards. So if we could play that, it would be great. It's early morning, late summer. Marine biologist Janis Lanshoff and I are diving as usual, documenting 1001 sea forest species, a multi-year project to highlight the lives of animals in the kelp forest. On our way out, we're distracted by an octopus in the shallows. Octopus vulgaris is number 1 on our list of 1001. This individual is very curious. Today we are looking for number 267, the shaggy sea hare, but the octopus has other plans for us. She glides out of her den in an unusual, bold move. I back away as fast as I can, but she's too quick. And grabs my camera while Janis is filming and laughing in his snorkel. I don't want to alarm her by taking the camera from her. I'm hoping she'll let it go, but she grinds the lens into the gravel. Her suckers explore and taste the camera. Then she slowly turns the camera to face us and starts filming. She gives us a moment to look at the world from her perspective, to look back at us. It's hard to imagine what her life is like, but she helps us to consider the lives of all the species who share our planet. When the lens was turned on us, we both realized that number 1001 should be Homo sapiens, the human being in the sea forest. We are part of wild nature, part of this underwater forest. She gives us inspiration to keep going with our work, to shed light on those who have no physical voices, but whose biological presence keeps us breathing. Eventually, she gives my camera back. I'll need a new lens, but the lesson she has taught us is priceless.
Oh, that's really cool. Well, that's very moving. Thank you, Craig. I think maybe I'll ask you one more question, then we'll start seeing some of the questions from folks here. In the beginning, I've known Craig a long time, and he was always doing things like diving with crocodiles and going into their lairs. No human has ever gone under the papyrus into where crocodiles retreat to, and no one's ever filmed it, so of course Craig is going to do that. What was driving you at that time? Because you were always putting yourself in some pretty crazy situations, man.
So, John, what was happening was I was so inspired to try and find this wild person inside me. I'd been with these incredible master trackers from the Kalahari, the Klo and the Glikwe, and they were right inside the wild, and I was outside, and I was desperate to find, and I was young and foolhardy. And we went up to the Okavango Delta and had these incredible adventures. And we managed to eventually get inside this lair where the massive croc dragged its prey. And this animal somehow, by a miracle, allowed us to be in there. And we managed to get out alive. This is after several weeks, a month of trying to dive with them. And we made a film about it. But what was so interesting was it was an incredible adventure. I was terrified a lot of the time. But what I've done now with this 12 years of immersing in the kelp forest, just going every day and observing the limpets, these are tiny little invertebrates that look almost like a rock, and they don't seem to do too much. Observing them every day and getting to know their lives, seeing how they tend their gardens, how they cultivate their gardens, figuring out why they're so high on the shore and why they're going up where it's so hot and they can almost die, and then seeing these incredible fish, these giant clingfish that have a massive suction pad under their bodies, surfing up the rocks and grabbing these limpets in their teeth and turning them, twisting them off, and realizing that this massive predatorial pressure from the ocean, from these extraordinary amphibious fish that surf out of the water, are keeping those limpets right up there. This daily practice, which is completely safe and not nearly as adventurous as diving with the crocodiles, is just so much more powerful. And ironically, that's what eventually got me inside of the wild. So it's an amazing lesson in a way, because as John said, getting to know a small spider or an insect on your porch and really knowing that animal is so much more powerful than, big adventures with huge charismatic creatures. So this is a lot what our work is about, is real connection to nature and appreciating biodiversity, which is the life support system of this planet, and looking at this life support system, this mother of mothers, that's looked after us since the beginning of time, appreciating her and doing everything we can to support her, because our lives depend on it and because we love her. We've had these relationships with wild animals and plants from the very beginning. It's only now in the last tiny % of time that we've severed some of those bonds. So all our work is about reconnecting with them and feeling the joy of that process.
Great. Well, let's hear from some of the people here. Sometimes the people who need to see your film or read your books, most are the hardest to reach. How do you go about this, reaching people, I suppose? Any specific strategy, or just let it flow or be? What is your strategy to reach the folks that are hardest? Yeah. So, what's been interesting about the film process after many years, and in many ways this book process, it hasn't been a case of
okay, this is the story idea, let's go out and try and find it and film it. It's rather about going into this wild environment and just keeping still and observing and watching and using all these techniques we're talking about and see what is the story that the wild, what is the story that these animals want to tell. And let them, I mean, nobody could have ever imagined some of these things, and I certainly wasn't expecting octopus to steal the camera or any of these things. So it's obviously a privilege to have the time to do that, and there's sacrifices in doing that. And it's often not a very good financial strategy because it takes a lot longer. But that's what we've tried to do. And I think that people can feel that. And the idea is to establish this sense of belonging, this desire to belong on our planet as part of the natural system. And I think that is a critical thing, that story, if we can get that out, can be an incredible motivator for us to look after this extraordinary biosphere that we're so dependent on.
Here's a really easy one. How long were you able to hold your breath?
I don't time these kind of things. It's the last thing I'm thinking about is how long I can hold my breath or not, or how deep I can dive. So that is not the priority with this diving. I have developed a technique where I can only have a few breaths on the surface and just keep going down for an hour or two. But I mean, not in total. Just maybe hold my breath for several minutes. It's hard to know. And when a big animal like a ray or something comes on, the last thing you're doing is checking how long when an animal does do that, the heartbeat does slow down and you can hold your breath for a lot longer. But I'm not into timing all of that stuff.
No. Several minutes. That's a good answer. Is there an animal that you still hope to see in the wild?
So I've always had a fascination for manatees. Of course, we don't get manatees. We get dugongs right up the coast, but I've never seen one. And this has been a real whirlwind trip here. We've had, sometimes very short time in the various cities in America. But we were so fortunate. We're down in Key West, and this wonderful guide took us out. And right at the end of the process, we had like a few, short time. We just saw this incredible flash, just a flash of a white body. And it was in a slightly tricky scenario underneath a dock. There were big metal spikes, boats, a floating bar above. These huge fish were coming into, someone was cleaning a fish, these tarpon, they were almost as big as me, swimming around. And Swati, my wonderful wife, and myself slipped off the kayaks. And there were these giant tarpon in the water, and I dropped down to the bottom and just waited. And 3 manatees just came slowly up, and the one enormous one just came closer and closer, and it was like literally an inch from my face. This massive eye looking, and it was so interesting to see this animal, because they don't have predators. They're very different to any animal I've encountered in the sea forest. Just no fear. And to establish a close connection like that, very unlikely, so quickly. So I had this amazing experience with it, and then came to the surface and all this music and everything. These 2 worlds, the wild and the tame, right there. It was very interesting and powerful. So, yeah.
But that was your most recent experience. Now, what was your first experience or memory about nature and observation that you can recall?
I was very fortunate to. My mother spent most days diving when I was in the womb. We lived in a house that half of the house was below the high water mark, so the waves used to come up around the house, and there were special boards that we put up during storms, otherwise every window would get broken. So I have these glimpses of memories of this incredible childhood in this space, and one of them was my brother and myself were very young, and enormous storm was raging outside, and we were having a bath, and this wave hit the door, broke open the door, and filled the entire bathroom with water right up to the level of the bath. And then we'd go out in the morning, and the entire lawn was covered in kelp, this deep, and the isopods, these beautiful crustaceans, used to come out during the storms and sometimes come through the house. So those are the kind of memories I have from childhood, early childhood.
Love that. This is a really great question. I think I've heard you tell stories about this, Craig, but I love this question. It's an important one. I loved all your questions so far, everyone, but this one is particularly interesting. Can you please share a story about a person who transitioned from nature apathy to nature, like gratitude, like the connection? What do you believe accounted for the change?
Oh, wonderful question. What comes to mind is we've fairly recently had this very interesting experience, funny enough, sparked by John. He was talking about song catching, this interesting old way of going into the wild and just waiting, and then a song comes to you. Anyway, he's an amazing musician and was able to do it quite easily, and I struggled tremendously to do this and wasn't able to, but I eventually managed to make instruments from whale's ear bones and from the kelp and from abalone, and it was a fascinating process, which ended in Yo-Yo Ma coming to our house and listening to us playing these incredible instruments. And this extraordinary singer, who's become a very good friend of ours, Zolani Mahola, was there. And she became interested in this and was incredibly good at song catching. We took her diving. And she carried on this diving after we took her, I think, 5 or 6 times. She carried on for 2 years going into the water, and she was a real natural. And the fascinating thing that happened was she grew up, her father was into the traditional Xhosa culture, and her mother was a Catholic, and she was at the church and singing in the church, and she wasn't, as a young person, not too keen on the culture. But this connection to nature and diving for these 2 years somehow changed her way of thinking, and all her Xhosa culture and her connection to her ancestors naturally just came into her being. And it was the most extraordinary thing to see that transformation. And her whole career changed. She went from doing sort of more pop songs and that to songs about belonging and about nature, and absolutely fascinating. In fact, we've made a film that we're busy working on about this. So it is quite extraordinary how people change when they're exposed to nature.
Yeah, good. What do you believe accounted for the change? What do you believe accounts for the change?
Wow. I mean, it's largely, a lot of these things are quite mysterious. And I certainly don't pretend to have all the answers. But I think that when you start doing these things, these threads to animals start forming. And as you bond with them, you get more and more of these threads. And this is what some of the San teachers have told us. As you build these threads and they wrap into these ropes, and these ropes are somehow, it's a metaphor, connected to our ancestors, those have come before, and to source, God, whatever you want to, whatever word you want to use, somehow starts mysteriously forming. So, and of course you've got this massive brain chemistry shift, especially in the water. So it activates that, and that wild person, again, that's in all of us, comes to the surface and remembers what we've done from the beginning. And we've, these cultures, these indigenous cultures who know nature so well, in fact, protect an enormous amount, the majority of the biodiversity on this planet. Those rhythms keep repeating and come to the surface.
That was a good answer. I think that you speak to that so kind of quickly, and I want to slow it down a little bit.
Thank you.
And I want everyone here and everyone out there watching on YouTube or watching recordings later just to sit for a moment and feel a pet that you had that you really loved, or a pet that you have now that you really love. And remember the feeling of that connection, right? Or a person that you really love. And then think about the communication that happens without words. Can you feel that? There's something really present there, right? And when we're talking about not one pet, but hundreds of species, hundreds of encounters, what happens when all those connections add up inside you? Can you feel that? What happens to you? Who do you become? And that brings me to a question that I have for you, Craig, that has to do with the near pristine wild. Because I think the closest I've gotten to the near pristine wild is Yellowstone National Park or the Okavango Delta, which, they're pretty darn good. But growing up and studying, the history of the ecology of this continent and other continents, I read accounts of what it was like here, 200-300 years ago, and what it was like all over this planet, and what we've lost. And of course, that can make us sad. But I remember when I went to the Okavango Delta for the first time, and I saw that sunset migration of hundreds of egrets and herons, and the wild dogs came out, and these big herds and I was just in the elephants and all. It was just unbelievable. I couldn't even process it. And when I came home, I didn't even talk about it because there was no way to share the overwhelm of magnificence that I felt, but also the great sadness, because I know from reading the history of this continent, it used to be like that here. And I'd love for you to talk about your experience in near pristine environments.
So not very long ago, we had the great fortune to visit a very remote island about 3,000 miles off East Africa, part of a research station to study and protect the incredible elasmobranch populations. And we arrived in this place, and I walked along the shore, and there were just thousands of tracks everywhere. The numbers of crabs, I had to walk so slowly to not step on them. The numbers of birds soaring around were, blocking parts of the sun out. The turtles, you could just see their heads coming up everywhere. After about half an hour walking, I must have seen 100 of them easily. Fins of sharks were just cutting through the water. I threw a stone in the water, and sharks just came to the stone. I threw it in shallower and eels came in there. Further out I saw these, because I was unfamiliar with it, these other extraordinary fins, and later swam out, and there were trains of manta rays feeding not far offshore. Further out, massive sharks. Sometimes when we were diving, you couldn't see the reef with the walls of fish. So in the undergrowth on the island, it was just teeming with thousands of these huge hermit crabs. It was just mind-blowing. But it was most interesting to feel the effect that had on the psyche. How one slept at night, how one felt, and it wasn't just me, everybody there was feeling this extraordinary sense of peace and wonder at what was going on. And like John said, then you realized, of course, the whole planet used to be like this. And you have the immense sense of what we've lost, but also the sense of, if we allow, we've still got these incredible biodiversity hotspots. If we let these places alone, they will repopulate vast areas. And this is exactly what's happened here. And luckily this area is now protected thanks to Save Our Seas Foundation. So nature has this incredible ability to regenerate. And we just need to take all these pressures off her and allow her to do her job. But as I say, the most incredible thing was to feel what that feels like, to just be there. And I think it's because we know, the primal mind, that wild person knows that this abundance, it's just, this is so safe, this environment, because it's easy to survive when there's so much abundance. Whereas the wild person can sense biodiversity. And in areas where it's minimized, you don't know, that wild person doesn't know you can go into a store or buy things. It just senses this loss, and the levels of anxiety increase. So I think that these places can teach us an enormous amount.
No, thank you. Going kind of in the opposite direction, how would you recommend someone getting closer, physically and spiritually, to the ocean, her creatures and beauty, if one does not boat, sail, or dive?
That's a great question, and I can answer that quite well, because my wife Swati, who supports me in all, we work together, hand in hand. She's an incredible conservation journalist, and has taught me most of what I know about conservation, social justice, so many other things. When we met, she was absolutely terrified of water. She'd had a near drowning incident as a child and wouldn't go near the water. And now she swims for 3 kilometers along the coast with me, and has dived with all these big animals with me, and still holds a tiny bit of that fear, but is incredible in the water. So it's just basically a very slow process. Don't try and go diving on your first day in the ocean. Choose a little secluded tidal pool that's maybe this deep. Put your feet in. I've taken many people who are absolutely terrified of water. Your feet, your hands, and you just slowly get used to it. Maybe spend a few months in that tidal pool in water that you can just stand in. Then eventually you'll get used to it, and you'll want to go a little bit further, and you'll get to know the tides and the swells and the wind and the currents. And it's just over time, then you will, like Swati, she's, goes out. I just see her swimming out miles to sea on her own now, and I just can't believe it. That person has changed so much. So it's just a slow, gradual process of getting to know and comfortable in the water.
So how many hundreds of thousands of years ago were our ancestors in the caves at the tip of Africa? How long ago was that?
So we have evidence for people gathering shellfish at about 170,000 years ago on the coast near to where I live. And then what we see is a fascinating change at about 100,000 years ago. We see one of the greatest changes in our entire species. We see for the first time scientific evidence of people taking an idea inside their head and engraving it onto a piece of ochre, the first symbols. So that in a way, these are the first proto-books or first proto-computers. Symboling is necessary for all the technology we see today. So in many ways, this part of the world where I am from has the largest collection of the earliest art and science. And what we developed is a sort of working hypothesis that perhaps this is the place in the world where we have the first human swimmers and divers. I think a little bit older than that, maybe at 120,000 years. We see massive abalone, massive turbo shells, and the bones of fish that come from quite far out that tend not to wash up in the cave. So it seems that these early people were highly proficient in swimming and diving and were using the ocean in a powerful way. And there are various ideas around the iodine that's available in the ocean, actually through the kelp and some of the shellfish. Whales used to wash up, so this incredible access to fat, which is critical for human survival. A whale washes up, you've got 20 tons of fat, 20 tons of meat. So I think the ocean played a fundamental role in our evolution as a species, and this incredible symbolic material culture that came out of southern Africa and influenced the entire world.
Do you think the baboons learned diving from our ancestors or the other way around? What? We have no way of answering that.
Yeah. But we have actually seen amazing, very rare circumstances where the baboons on hot days actually dive in the kelp forest. It was quite an extraordinary thing to see. So yeah, I've no idea. But certainly, animals are swimming and people would be curious to do the same thing.
Yeah, I'm sure of that. In My Octopus Teacher, did you grieve the loss of the octopus? It brought us to tears for my husband and I. It was such a profound and moving film. It had such a strong impact on the writer of this. But did you grieve?
Of course, deeply.
Yeah.
How are we doing for time?
We got 3 minutes, and I'm about to wrap up.
Cool.
And it's really hard because they're all such good questions, and I hate that we run out of time. But this one I think is important, Craig. How can we introduce or teach a better understanding and appreciation of nature in schools and our education systems?
Yeah, that's the absolute critical one. And I think what we need to do is, in order to teach about nature, you really need to understand her deeply and spend time in nature and learning from wild animals. It's very difficult to teach just from textbooks. So I think it would be absolutely fantastic if trackers, people who are spending a lot of time in nature, can actually be integrated into education and take children into the wild, teach them tracking, teach them animal behavior face to face. I think that's a fundamental thing that can change education and general connection to nature.
Lovely, thank you. Well, our thanks to Craig Foster, author of Amphibious Soul, Finding the Wild in a Tame World. We encourage you to pick up a copy of Craig's new book here or at your local bookstore. And if you would like to support the club's effort in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit their website, commonwealthclub.org. I'm John Young, and thank you, and take care, everyone.